Let me tell you something that happened to me many years ago, and that has probably happened to you as well. You plant with all the care in the world. You prepare the soil, place the seed in the right spot, water it at the right time, and wait patiently. And then, one morning, you walk out to the garden and find exactly what no gardener wants to see. Leaves full of holes, tender shoots eaten, the plant you cared for so carefully looking as if something spent the entire night devouring it while you slept. So you drive to the store, buy a product that promises to solve everything, apply it and wait. A week later, the problem is back. And that's when the thought begins to creep in. Maybe growing your own food is really something only people with access to expensive products can do. Maybe it's for those who can spend more money, or for those who somehow know a secret nobody ever told you. But what nobody told you is that this secret does exist. The difference is that it isn't sitting on a shelf at a garden centre. It lives in the memory of people who have been planting for centuries without depending on any of those products. My name is Samuel Carter. I was born and raised around farmland, learned how to plant long before I learned how to write, and I spent decades of my life trying to understand why some gardens thrive without any chemical products, while others seem to suffer from pests all the time. The answer I eventually found didn't come from any modern agronomy book. It came from observation, and from listening to older growers who had spent their lives working the soil. It came from understanding a method that communities who have cultivated the land for generations practiced naturally. Something that took me years to fully comprehend. Today, I want to talk to you about that method, about what makes Amish gardens so special, about the simple stake that can protect entire crops without any chemicals, and about why companies that sell pesticides will never teach you this. But to understand what I'm about to show you, you first need to understand something about how soil really works. Soil isn't just a place where a plant sits while waiting for you to feed it. Soil is a living system, deep, complex, and full of relationships most people have never stopped to notice. When you plant in healthy soil, soil that has life, balance, and the right organisms in the right places, the plants that grow there naturally develop resistance to pests that goes far beyond anything a spray bottle could ever offer. This isn't theory. It's something I watched happen with my own eyes for decades. The Amish communities have a relationship with the land that modern agriculture simply cannot imitate, because to imitate it would require slowing down, observing carefully, and accepting something many people find difficult to accept today. Nature understands its own balance better than any industrial product ever could. When you visit an Amish garden and spend enough time there to truly notice the details, one of the first things that stands out is what's missing. There are no bottles, no sprays, no containers scattered around the garden beds, and where those things are absent, something else is present. You see plants growing in thoughtful combinations. You see living soil that hasn't been stripped of the organisms that belong there. And you see a practice that has been used for generations. Something simple enough that anyone can learn and apply using materials they already have at home. That practice involves the use of stakes. But not just any stake. and not in the way most people would imagine. To understand why this works, you first need to understand what a pest actually is. A pest does not appear out of nowhere. It appears where conditions allow it to multiply. It appears where plants are weakened, where soil has lost its balance, and where the natural predators that should control those insects have been eliminated by harmful practices. When you use a chemical pesticide to kill one insect, you almost always kill the insects that would have eaten that insect as well. You solve the problem for 1 week and create a much larger problem for the following month, because now the pest can multiply without any natural control. That is the cycle pesticide companies rarely explain, because that cycle is exactly what makes people buy more product. The Amish never entered that cycle. They preserved practices that respect the full chain of life within a garden ecosystem. And within those practices, there is one that I want to explain to you slowly and carefully, because it is far deeper and far more effective than it first appears. The stake I'm talking about is simply a post. It can be made of bamboo, wood, or any natural material you have available. But the material itself is not what matters. What matters is what is done with it, where it is placed, and why that positioning can completely change the behavior of insects around your plants. Let me explain the principle behind it. In Amish gardens, these stakes are used as part of a system that guides the biodiversity of the garden bed. They place the stakes in strategic locations within and around their crops, not randomly, but based on generations of observing insect behavior. Around these stakes, and along their positions, they plant, or allow to grow, specific plants that function either as natural repellents or as attractors for predators of the most common garden pests. The stake itself acts as a structure, a marker, and a support for the system. But it also serves another function that many modern gardeners would never have imagined. Some beneficial insects need elevated points where they can land, observe, and locate their prey. By creating these elevated points strategically throughout the garden bed, you are essentially building hunting posts for the allies that keep pests under control. Dragonflies, ladybugs, and small predatory wasps that hunt caterpillars and aphids all use elevated points as operational bases. When a garden provides these structures in the right places, the natural balance of the ecosystem restores itself far more efficiently than any spray ever could. But this is only part of the method. The other part involves what is applied to the stake itself, and this is where ancestral Amish knowledge becomes truly fascinating to anyone who has never thought deeply about the subject. Over generations, they developed a simple preparation made from ingredients that almost anyone has access to. This mixture is applied to the stakes and to the edges of the garden beds, at intervals determined by careful observation of nature around them. This preparation doesn't kill insects. It does something far more intelligent. It changes the scent profile of the air around the plants, making the garden bed effectively invisible to pests that rely primarily on smell to locate the plants they prefer to attack. Many destructive insects locate plants from long distances through scent. The specific smell a plant releases when it is healthy and growing is exactly the signal those insects look for when searching for food. When you change that scent signal around the garden bed using ingredients that nature itself provides, you don't need to kill anything. You simply disappear from the pest's radar. They pass nearby and fail to detect what they were looking for. The Amish traditionally used a combination of herbs that grew naturally around their farms. These herbs were fermented or crushed in water, sometimes with the addition of anthill soil or wood ash. This mixture was then applied to the stakes and to the soil around the plant roots. Each ingredient plays a specific role within the system. The herbs change the scent profile of the environment. The ash adjusts the pH on the soil surface and repels certain insects that cannot tolerate alkaline conditions. Anthill soil, which carries substances produced by ants over many years, contains compounds that many destructive insects interpret as a signal of hostile territory and instinctively avoid. When you combine these elements intentionally, you are not trying to attack the pest. You are rebuilding an environment where the pest cannot comfortably exist. And that difference is enormous compared to what the industry sells you. The industry sells you combat. Traditional wisdom offers balance. And balance is lasting. Combat must be repeated endlessly. I want to pause here for a moment because I feel it's important to ask you something honestly. Have you ever planted with great care, done everything right, and still watched your garden or backyard plot get taken over by pests, fungus, or insects that seem impossible to control? Have you ever felt frustrated enough to think that growing food at home simply might not be for you? I want you to share that experience in the comments, because I know many people go through this silently and assume they are doing something wrong, when in reality the only thing missing is a piece of knowledge that never reached them. If you've lived through this, write the sentence I'm about to suggest in the comments. Write this: I lost crops to pests and almost gave up planting. This simple phrase helps other people reading the comments realize they are not alone in this struggle. And sometimes that can start a conversation that becomes far more valuable than anything sold on a store shelf. And if you're not subscribed to this channel yet, this is the right moment to do it. Here we talk about forgotten knowledge, techniques that truly work, and practices that allow anyone to produce food with independence, without depending on industrial solutions. Every video you watch here carries a piece of wisdom that someone before us lived in practice, and that deserves to be preserved. Subscribe now and turn on notifications so you don't miss anything. Now, returning to the stake method, I want to explain how to apply it in practice. Understanding the principle alone is not enough if you don't know how to use it in your own garden bed. The first thing you need is the stakes themselves. Bamboo is the best material because it is easy to find, lasts a long time, doesn't rot quickly when exposed to soil moisture, and has a texture that beneficial insects can easily grip when they land. If you don't have bamboo, any sturdy natural wood will work. Avoid wood that has been chemically treated, because those substances can contaminate the mixture you'll apply and disrupt the balance you're trying to create. The stakes should be tall enough to remain visible above the plants you're protecting. This is important because the beneficial insects you want to attract need to be able to see the landing point from a distance. In most vegetable gardens, stakes standing about 16 to 24 inches above the soil surface work well. For taller crops like tomatoes or peppers, you can use larger stakes, which are often needed as plant supports anyway. The placement of the stakes follows a simple principle that the Amish described as protecting the corners and covering the centre. In practice, this means placing stakes at the 4 corners of the planting area, adding a few along the edges, and placing at least 1 or 2 in the centre if the garden bed is larger than roughly 20 square feet. This layout creates what I like to call a network of presence. When beneficial insects occupy these landing points, they begin monitoring the entire space around that garden bed. Their coverage is far greater than it might seem, because a single predatory insect can consume dozens of pests in a single day. Now comes the preparation that is applied to the stakes. I'm going to share the simplest mixture I learned over the years, one that anyone can prepare at home with almost no cost. You will need a handful of leaves from plants that have natural repellent properties. Rue, rosemary, mint, and basil are among the easiest to find, and all of them contain aromatic compounds that interfere with the scent signals pests rely on to locate plants. If you only have one of these available, use what you have. Ideally, you combine 2 or 3 to create a broader scent profile in the environment. Take these leaves and crush them in water. This simply means pressing and grinding them in a container filled with water until the water takes on the colour and strong scent of the herbs. Use about 1 quart of water for every 3 handfuls of fresh leaves. Let the mixture rest for at least 12 hours in a closed container. After that resting period, strain the liquid and add 2 tablespoons of wood ash if you have it available. The ash is optional, but it strengthens the repellent effect because it changes the pH on the surface where it is applied. Mix it well, and your preparation is ready. This liquid should be applied with a cloth or brush directly onto the stakes, covering their surface up to about halfway up their length. The portion buried in the soil does not need treatment. The section above the soil is what matters. You should also apply the mixture around the base of each stake in the soil, forming a circle about 8 inches in diameter. This soil application creates the scent barrier at ground level, where many insects move before climbing onto the plants themselves. The ideal frequency for applying the mixture is once a week during the first 2 months. After that, it can be reduced to once every 2 weeks, as the natural balance of the garden begins to establish itself. After heavy rain, however, you should reapply it regardless of when the last application happened. Rain dilutes the preparation in the soil and weakens the scent barrier that protects the plants. Over time, you'll begin to recognize when the garden needs another application simply by observing insect activity. When pests start appearing in larger numbers again, it's usually a sign that the scent barrier has weakened and needs to be renewed. There is one detail of the Amish method that took me much longer to fully understand, and very few people know about it, even among those who have heard of the stake system. This detail involves choosing exactly where inside the garden bed each stake should be placed based on the direction of the sun. For generations, the Amish observed that certain pests prefer to approach crops from the side that remains shaded during the afternoon. The intense heat of the afternoon sun tends to bother them, so they naturally enter from the cooler side of the garden. That means the stakes placed on the west side of the bed, the side facing the stronger afternoon sun, require a lower concentration of the herbal mixture. Meanwhile, the stakes on the east and north sides, which are more protected from the harsh afternoon sunlight, require a slightly stronger concentration to compensate for the reduced natural barrier created by heat. This type of observation is what separates knowledge that simply works from knowledge that works exceptionally well. Nature has logic in everything. Once you begin to see that logic, you stop working against it and start working with it. And that is exactly where traditional agriculture had an advantage over many modern industrial approaches. The farmers of earlier generations had time, and more importantly, they had the patience to observe. They weren't in a rush to solve today's problem with a spray that would create a bigger problem tomorrow. They wanted to understand how the system functioned, so it could continue functioning for decades. Let me tell you about another practice the Amish combined with the stake method, one that strengthens the results even further, and can also be done with simple resources. They called these plants the edge guardians. This practice consists of planting a line of specific plants around the borders of the garden bed, forming a natural protective layer. These border plants are chosen for two main reasons. First, they release scents that confuse and repel the most common pests in the area. Second, they attract beneficial insects that both pollinate plants and help control pests at the same time. The plants the Amish often preferred for this purpose were those that produce many small flowers. Small flowers provide easily accessible nectar for small insects, which are precisely the natural predators of many destructive pests. Tagetes, often known as marigolds, is possibly one of the most effective border plants available, and it has been used by the Amish for centuries. It repels soil nematodes, discourages flies and other insects that damage roots and stems, and at the same time attracts beneficial beetles and flies that prey on aphids and caterpillars. A simple row of marigolds around a garden bed already provides considerable protection. When combined with the stakes and the herbal preparation, the marigold border completes the protection system in a way no industrial product can imitate. Industrial solutions don't understand that real protection must be a system, not a single isolated attack. When you create the scent barrier on the stakes, provide landing points that attract predators, and establish a protective border of plants, you build an environment where pests simply cannot thrive. They arrive, sense that the territory is not suitable for them, and move on. But I need to be honest with you about something important. This method is not instant. The first time you build this system in your garden bed, it may take several weeks before the balance fully establishes itself. During that time, you may still see some pests appear. Don't panic and don't rush to buy a chemical spray. Doing that would destroy exactly the balance you are trying to build. The system needs time to organize itself. Beneficial insects need time to discover the landing points you created. The border plants need time to grow and release their scents more strongly. The herbal preparation needs to build its scent barrier through repeated applications. This waiting period is exactly what pushes many people away from methods like this and back toward quick industrial solutions. And it's also what companies count on, because they know that human impatience is their greatest ally. When you understand that this method takes time, and when you have the patience to wait, the result that eventually appears is far more lasting than anything a product could offer. The balance you created begins to maintain itself. Natural predators remain present. The border plants continue growing. The herbal preparation continues to be reapplied. And the garden stays protected without you needing to buy anything. There is another dimension to this method that I consider just as important as the technical side, and it is rarely mentioned when people talk about traditional growing practices. That dimension is observation. Not the quick glance someone gives the garden in the morning before leaving for work. I'm talking about real observation, slow, patient observation. The kind where you sit beside the garden bed long enough to see what happens when the garden believes no one is watching. Among the Amish, this was part of the culture. Children were taught from an early age to sit and observe before taking action. To understand what each insect was doing, where it came from, where it was going, and what it was feeding on, that careful attention is what built, over generations, the deep knowledge they developed about the behavior of pests and predators. It did not come from scientific research in laboratories with microscopes. It came from attention, from presence, from the kind of intelligence that only appears when you slow down enough to truly notice what is right in front of you. I learned this lesson far too late in my life. I spent decades trying to act quickly, solve problems quickly, and produce more in less time. It was only when I began to slow down and truly observe that I realized the soil has its own rhythm. And when you respect that rhythm instead of trying to force it, the results become far greater and far more sustainable than anything rushed effort could ever produce. That is a lesson industrial agriculture will never teach you, because its entire model depends on your impatience. Now, I want to talk to you about another aspect of the stake method that goes beyond pest protection. It reveals a level of understanding about nature that the Amish developed, an understanding that even the most modern agronomist, with all the latest tools, might struggle to explain purely in technical terms. This aspect has to do with the role of the stakes as indicators of soil health. When you place a stake in the soil of a garden and come back to observe it a few weeks later, it begins to tell a story. If around the base of the stake you notice termites or other insects that feed on decomposing material, it can indicate that the soil in that spot contains an excess of organic matter that has not yet broken down. That may signal an imbalance in microbial activity within the soil. On the other hand, if around the stake you find no signs of life at all, no insects, no fungi, no moss attempting to establish itself, that can be an even more concerning sign. It suggests that the soil there may be biologically inactive, lacking the microbial life necessary to nourish plants properly. The Amish used stakes in this way to read the soil. They would move them from place to place as the seasons changed, observing what happened around them and using those clues to decide where to plant certain crops, where to add compost, and where the soil needed time to rest. This type of soil reading is a diagnostic practice that anyone can learn with patience and attention. It requires no specialized equipment. It requires only observation and the ability to remember what you observed before. Over the years, I developed the habit of recording everything I noticed around the stakes in my garden in a simple notebook. The types of insects present, how frequently they appeared, the time of year, the temperature during each period, which pests tried to establish themselves, and how the system responded each time. That notebook is now more valuable to me than any agriculture manual I have ever read. It holds the living memory of my garden over many seasons, allowing me to anticipate problems before they occur, because I recognize the patterns that precede each type of imbalance. This habit of recording and remembering was something the Amish also maintained collectively across generations. When you have a community of people growing food together and sharing observations for 100 years or more, the collective memory that builds over time becomes an incredibly powerful tool, one that no technology can easily replace. That is one reason Amish gardens continue to remain productive and balanced in communities that maintain these practices, while the industrial model surrounding them often exhausts the soil, increases dependence on external inputs, and creates new problems that require even more products to solve. Now let me talk about the relationship between the stakes and water in the garden bed, because this is an aspect most people never connect to the method. But the Amish understood it very well. The placement of the stakes also influences how rainwater and irrigation distribute themselves through the soil. When stakes are positioned strategically, they create small physical barriers that slow the flow of water across the soil surface. This allows more water to sink vertically into the ground instead of running off the garden bed. This becomes especially important on slightly sloped ground or during periods of heavy rain. The Amish noticed this effect through generations of observation and incorporated it into how they positioned their stakes. It is no coincidence that the stakes along the edges of Amish garden beds are always more numerous than those in the center. The edges are where water runoff is strongest, and therefore where more physical barriers are needed to retain moisture. This level of detail is what separates a technique that merely appears to work from one that functions as a fully integrated system. The moisture that remains around the stakes and along the border plants also creates a slightly more humid microclimate at the edges of the garden bed. And that microclimate favors exactly the kinds of beneficial insects you want to attract to the landing points. Many natural predators of garden pests prefer environments with some level of humidity, where they can settle and reproduce. By creating these conditions intentionally, you are not only attracting those insects, you are also allowing them to reproduce within the garden itself, establishing a permanent population of natural allies that keep pests under control without additional effort. This is what I call the intelligence of the soil. It is not magic. It is not coincidence. It is the patient application of deep knowledge about how living systems function, accumulated over long periods of time by people who had no choice but to learn from nature, because nature was the only resource available to them. And that is exactly the kind of knowledge I believe needs to be preserved and shared, because it is not something you will easily find in the places modern industry and education systems usually point you toward. There is another practice the Amish combined with the stake method that very few people know about. I learned about it indirectly through accounts from people who had lived among these communities. They called it planting for the birds. The idea was simple, but powerful. In each garden bed, they maintained a few plants that produced small seeds or fruits capable of attracting insect-eating birds. These birds, while visiting the garden in search of seeds, would also consume large numbers of pest insects along the way. The regular presence of small birds in a garden can significantly reduce populations of caterpillars, destructive beetles, and aphids, because these insects are rich sources of protein that many small bird species actively seek. The stakes also played an important role in this system, because birds use them as perches before descending to the ground in search of food. This behavior is instinctive for most birds, which prefer having an elevated observation point before landing on the ground where they might be vulnerable. By creating those perching points with the stakes, you are also creating conditions that made birds feel safe enough to visit the garden regularly. This system, where stakes, beneficial insects, birds, border plants, and herbal preparations work together, is what forms the complete method. Each element on its own has an effect, but when they operate together, the effect multiplies exponentially, because every part of the system strengthens the others. That is what the Amish developed over generations without ever needing a single bottle of pesticide. Now, I need to tell you something about adaptation, because it would be dishonest of me to present this method as a rigid formula that must be followed exactly as described. The truth is that every garden bed is different. Every region has different pests, different birds, different border plants available, and different climate conditions. The principle of the method is universal, but its application must always be adapted to each person's environment. And that adaptation is done, once again, through observation. When you begin applying the method and carefully watch what works and what needs adjustment in your particular context, you are doing exactly what the Amish did across generations. You are building your own knowledge about your own garden bed. And that knowledge built through direct observation becomes more valuable than anything I or anyone else could teach you, because it is specific to your soil, your climate, your pests, and your conditions. What I can offer you are the principles and the initial tools. What you build with them over time will be entirely yours. And that ownership of knowledge, the autonomy that comes from understanding your own garden, is what true food self-sufficiency really means. It's not just about producing food. It's about knowing how to produce food in your place, with your resources, in a way that works for you. That is real independence. I also need to mention the importance of living soil within this entire system, because without it, nothing I described works as it should. The stakes, the border plants, the herbal preparations, the attraction of birds and beneficial insects. All of it depends on soil that contains active microbial life, earthworms, beneficial fungi, and the biological capacity to support strong plants. A plant growing in dead soil, soil without microbial life, and without proper organic matter, is a vulnerable plant. And no external method will fully protect a vulnerable plant. That is why the Amish never separated pest protection from soil care. For them, it was all part of the same system. Caring for the soil was the first line of defense. Plants that grow in living, balanced soil develop natural resistance to pests far beyond what the naked eye can easily perceive. They produce natural chemical compounds that make them less attractive to insects. Their tissues are stronger. They recover more quickly from damage. Modern science has confirmed this as well. Plants stressed by poor soil conditions are far more susceptible to pests than plants growing in healthy soil. So when you build the stake system in your garden bed, also ask yourself about the condition of your soil. If it is compacted, depleted, or lifeless, address that first. Add good quality compost. Cover the surface of the soil with straw or dried leaves to protect microbial life near the surface. Avoid digging the soil deeper than necessary, because deep digging destroys the fungal networks that plants use to exchange nutrients and communicate underground. Give the soil what it needs, and the soil will give the plant what it needs. And a healthy plant will resist pests in ways that often surprise anyone used to seeing weak plants constantly being devoured. When the soil, the stakes and the border plants begin functioning together, you will start noticing something that I consider one of the most beautiful things that can happen in a well-managed garden. You will notice that the garden begins to defend itself. When a pest tries to establish itself, something in the system responds. Birds arrive. Predatory insects become active. Nearby plants release compounds that interfere with the pest's appetite. The garden becomes alive in a way that goes far beyond simply growing. It responds. It adjusts. It defends itself. That is the wisdom that was lost when modern agriculture decided it was easier and more profitable to sell a spray than to teach people how the system actually works. This loss was not accidental. It was an economic decision that benefited an entire industry, while costing growers their autonomy, their independence, and their connection to the natural intelligence of the soil. Every time you learn a piece of this knowledge and apply it in your garden bed, you are reclaiming something that already belongs to you. You reconnect with a way of producing food that does not depend on buying anything, and you pass that understanding forward to your children, your neighbors, or anyone who learns alongside you here. That is something I learned after decades of working with the land that I want to leave you with before we finish. Nature never solves one problem by creating a bigger problem. When an insect population grows too large, nature responds by increasing predators, reducing available food for that insect, or altering environmental conditions that limit its expansion. The system corrects itself because the system operates on balance, not profit. Industrial agriculture operates on profit. And that profit often depends on your problem continuing to exist. It depends on pests returning again and again. It depends on you never discovering that a garden can defend itself when the right conditions are created. The knowledge the Amish preserved across generations is knowledge the economic system would rather you never discover. Because the moment you do, you may stop buying products you never actually needed. This is not a call to ignore science or reject every form of external help that may be safe and effective. It is a call to understand that there are solutions that do not pass through the checkout counter of any company. Solutions that often work better than anything sold in a bottle. And those solutions are available to anyone willing to learn, observe, and give the system enough time to organize itself. That idea is what drives this channel, and it is what motivated me to share what I have learned with you. If you've made it this far, you've already shown that you're truly willing to learn, and that is the most important quality any grower can have. It's not the most fertile soil, it's not the biggest piece of land, and it's not the most expensive equipment. What matters most is the willingness to sit down and observe, to ask why, to experiment patiently, to write down what works and what doesn't, and to share with others what you discover. That is the spirit that shaped Amish gardens into what they are today, and it is the same spirit that can transform your own garden bed into something far greater than you might imagine. You don't have to be Amish to apply these principles. You don't need a large farm, abundant resources, or decades of experience. What you need is attention, patience, and the willingness to trust the intelligence of nature more than the products the industry tries to sell you. That's all. And it's completely within your reach right now. If this video reached you today, perhaps it's not a coincidence. Maybe you are at exactly the right moment to begin looking at your garden in a different way, to apply this method, to observe what happens, and to realize that the soil has far more to offer than most people ever imagine when they choose to work with it rather than against it. That is the invitation I'm making to you today. If you haven't subscribed to this channel yet, now is the time to do it. Subscribe so you don't miss the next lessons, and give this video a like so it can reach other people who also need this knowledge. And write in the comments what you learned today, or which part of the method you plan to start applying in your own garden. I want to hear about your experience. I want to follow your journey, and I want you to remember that the ancient knowledge I'm sharing with you here is the same knowledge that allowed entire generations of families to grow healthy food with independence and respect for the land. You deserve access to that knowledge, and now you have it.